Well, good afternoon, Transylvania community. Thank you for joining the Political Science Department and the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee for this town hall to discuss the current situation regarding the November 3rd election. My name is Summer Taylor, and I'm the Student Government Association President. I have a major in political science, and I'm a senior, and I'm also your moderator for this afternoon. So before we begin, everyone take a breath, because I know it's been intense. But I imagine that there are many of you all who are here with questions and concerns regarding this unprecedented election situation. Who's won? Who has the popular vote? Who's going to get Pennsylvania's electoral votes? Who is going on, what is going on in general? Luckily, you guys have come to the right place because I'm joined this afternoon with three panelists who are going to be answering many of these questions and can hopefully provide you some clarity in this electoral situation. I would now like to briefly introduce these panelists in the order in which they will be speaking and answering questions for this town hall. First, I would like to welcome Associate Professor Stephen Hess, who is the Program Director of Political Science.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Next, I would like to welcome Don Doogie, who is the Professor of Political Science.
Hello.
All right, and I would lastly like to welcome Dr. Deidre Denney, who is the Transylvania University Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion.
Good afternoon.
Thank you guys all for being here. The format of this afternoon's panel will be that of 4 specified questions that our panelists will answer with about 2 to 3 minute responses. And then we'll move to this next portion of the town hall where I will then ask panelists questions taken from the audience. So please, while our panelists are speaking, put questions into the Q&A icon box that is found at the bottom of your screen. I will try to get to as many questions as I can. And I will also remind you that closed captions can also be activated by clicking the closed caption icon found at the bottom of your screen. All right, so let's get started. Let's move to the panelist discussion with their first set of questions. The first question being, how has the 2020 election differed from the 2016 election? Professor Hess, you were first.
Okay, so we've seen a few changes from 2016 to 2020. Front and center is that this election is unfolding in the middle of unprecedented conditions related to the pandemic. So we have seen unprecedented levels of absentee voting, mail-in balloting, and that has created a lot of the, some of the confusion about electoral returns. We have, we will be waiting for some time as there is tabulation of, mail-in ballots, absentee ballots. It takes longer to tabulate those kinds of ballots. Also, some of the upper Midwest states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania and Michigan have put rules in place where you cannot start certifying mail-in ballots until Election Day. So there's been something of a mad rush to try to get those finished. Also, just the reality is that Donald Trump is now running as an incumbent against a challenger, and historically we've seen. There's a very strong incumbency advantage for most presidents. So you might remember, there's incumbents very rarely lose. So the last time it happened was George Bush Sr. And before that, we're going all the way back to 1980. So when Jimmy Carter was defeated. So that's a 40-year period where you've only seen one defeat by an incumbent. So those are some of the important differences that I'd like to point out. Thank you.
Dr. Doogie, how has the 2020 election differed from the 2016 election?
Well, I think Steve's right in suggesting that the environment for the election is dramatically different than many previous elections. One thing that I would build on in terms of a point he made is that the alternative forms of voting which have been allowed during this pandemic have demonstrated, I think, the viability of alternative modes in place of in-person voting. we have an archaic voting system. And again, on Tuesdays from 6 to 6 is hardly one that encourages a lot of participation. You'll note that the participation in this election was considerably higher. Estimates up to 65% of the eligible voters, 150 million possible voters. That's considerably more than the usual 55 or so that participate in presidential elections. Another aspect of the political environment, though, is that this has been a really rancorous political environment. We've had 4 years where we've had some of the worst aspects of U.S. society laid bare. Our nativism, racism, sexism, exploitation of the weak, contempt for the vulnerable, corruption, all these sorts of things. It sets a tone during the election, and it adds, a subsequent question will be about polarization. Well, certainly the tone is added to polarization. Now, one of the things that's happened is that there's been a thing that's different from the last election, is that in the last election, 2016, you had some Republican elites who separated themselves from Trump, the no more Trump people. This time, there were more Republican elites who separated themselves in the form of the Lincoln Project and people like that. However, it didn't extend to his base supporters. It was only among some of the Republican elite, and not all of them. One of the things about the Republican elite is that you have a lot of opportunists who are going to support whomever can maximize their returns. Among the Democrats were not as splintered as they were in the presidential campaign as they were in 2016. Remember, Barry Sanders supporters to some extent abandoned the party in terms of support during that election. This time, the slate itself helped to overcome some of the splintering. Again, you had both a sort of mainline Democrat and a more progressive Democrat on the ticket. That's not to say that the Democrats aren't splintering. I understand that there's a great deal of unrest among House members for the lack of gaining a greater majority, and there's even talk already about replacing Pelosi. So we'll see how that plays out.
Thank you, Dr. Doogie. Dr. Denney, how has the 2020 election differed from the 2016 election?
Thank you, Summer. So building off of what Steve and Donna said, there's a couple of things that come to mind. Right now, the number of people of color that came out to vote almost is a mirror of 2008. And so with the numbers and the groundswell of support for getting out to vote and making sure that people knew how to get registered, where to go, those kinds of things. A big difference in that is the level of voter suppression seems to be ridiculous in 2020 as compared to 2016. And I think that a lot of that has to do with where we get our news from. Social media now is the national news for many, many people, not the CNN or the NBCs or the Washington Post like we're used to in days gone by. So people are able to get their information from certain areas on social media that speak to their belief system. Whether it is accurate information or not, it is given to them in such a way that it is believable. And so that's a big difference. And then we've got on top of the election, or in the, I should say before the election and in the middle of this, what Steve talked about and Don about the difference in the environment that people are, the pandemic has kept people away from each other, so to speak. And so there's not a lot of cross-pollination person to person. Now you get all of your information from like we're the Brady Bunch in this box. And, you know, and gives you time to go and be a keyboard thug is what I call them, folks that go on social media and put up crazy memes and attack people on Facebook and Twitter and what have you. And so people aren't afraid anymore of just thinking their opinion is fact. So people are having a tough time in 2020 separating fact and fiction and truth. And I think the biggest difference for me is that the level of lies that are out there about all the political parties, about the platforms, about the candidates, it doesn't matter who, whether we're talking a local election or a national election, the lies that just are coming left and right and center, that people are turning off and tuning out and had made their decision. Early voting made a big difference there. People could just go vote and then turn off the election and just sit and wait to see what's going to happen, which, you know, who knows when we're going to know. Next week, maybe, I guess.
By Friday, probably.
Friday, this Friday or next Friday.
So kind of taking what you said, Dr. Denney, and then also mentioning Dr. Doogie's polarization. The next question is, why has our political system become so polarized in recent electoral cycles? And perhaps is the uncertainty of this election and the information that was put out about this election accelerated that polarization? Professor Hess, you're first.
Okay, so polarization has really been, taken root and expanded since the 1970s in the U.S. So it does have really old origins, and we are at kind of a high water point for polarization. But in the political science literature, there's a lot of emphasis on institutions. So we have a very open primary system. We have relatively weak parties with low discipline. So there's not a lot of barriers to entry in terms of entering the primary system. And when you look at some of the more extreme candidates who have made their way into the system on the right, for example, we've had a couple of new House members who are open advocates of the QAnon conspiracy theory. We've also seen kind of the rise of a more progressive left. Like AOC and other candidates are very, very strongly progressive, and they have won their seats by defeating incumbents in the primary. Also, we've seen gerrymandering. So as the technology has improved, we've seen party organizers with really with great precision be able to go street by street and create new districts that are almost ensured to guarantee that you have very little ideological diversity or racial diversity within these districts, so that you can maximize your vote count. And when you have all these gerrymandered districts, one of the issues that comes up is that as an incumbent running for re-election, you aren't really concerned about running against the other party in the general election. What you're actually concerned about is a more extreme primary challenger. And so because of that, you have issues where in the past you might have seen more cooperation across the aisle and more bipartisan cooperation. Deal making now is almost a taboo that would make you that would become a liability. If you were to reach across the aisle and make a deal with somebody on the other side, you could then be attacked from the fringe by somebody who's more ideological pure, and then also appeals to a more extreme primary electorate. So we know that turnout is very, very low in primaries, and so as a result, people who are really gung-ho party activists who tend to be more towards the ideological extreme have an outsized role in terms of selecting who the candidates are going to be. And so we see that that's been a big pattern. There's also changes in the media environment that we've seen. We've seen the rise of partisan media. So, in the past, you would have, 3 news channels, and you would have characters like Walter Cronkite who would kind of curate the news and would try to represent both sides and just the facts, ma'am, and just kind of represent the news, as it happens. And since that time, we've now got more an ideological sorting where if you are conservative, you're more likely to watch Fox News. If you are more liberal, you're more likely to watch MSNBC. And because of that, we've started to see people getting completely different mediated realities. And this has been accelerated by the emergence of social media, where, you know, I'm in this dopamine feedback loop when I'm on social media. And if I see something that appeals to me and I click on it and I want to read it, then, you know, the algorithm will start to profile me and say, that's the kind of thing that I want to see. And as a result, it'll start filtering the kinds of news stories that I'm getting. And I will stop getting information that conflicts with that. And so with that, we get ideologically sorted into these media silos. And as you've seen, you get put into completely different mediated realities and universes when you go down that road. And as a result, we don't see as much conversation between people who are in different ideological camps. There's also just sorting that goes on, you know, where we've seen the two parties start to separate, where the Democratic Party has more support in the cities. The Republicans have more support in the countryside. The suburbs are kind of the only contested space between those. We've seen the Conservative Party really dominate evangelical Christians and Christian conservatives. We've seen the Democratic Party become more secular. Since 2016, we've seen education become more of a differentiating factor between different parties. Although that rolled back modestly a little bit in 2000, Joe Biden has been a little bit more successful appealing to whites without a college education than Hillary Clinton was. So that's modified it a little bit. And we've seen, you know, race and ethnicity become a really defining characteristic of the two different parties. And we just live in a very segregated society. And so we have social networks and social pools where all of our friends are liberals or all of our friends are conservatives, and we don't really have a lot of cross-pollination between them. And also, I'll just end on this one, but there's been surveys that done, you know, if you're a liberal, would you want your son or daughter to marry a conservative? And a growing number of people have said, no, I would not accept, you know, a son-in-law or a daughter-in-law being a person of the other party. And so just this sort of hostility and negative partisanship that's emerged is something that's really separated our country and made it difficult to have a constructive dialogue across society.
Thank you. Dr. Doogie, what do you think has created the polarization in our recent electoral cycles, and what has accelerated that polarization perhaps during this specific election?
The list is long. Steve's quite right about the mechanics of elections. One of the real problems we have in this country is the primary system. In the first place, the turnout is very low, and it tends to be the hardcore members of a party. And more recently, it's been a situation. I remember writing a piece for Business Lexington a few years ago when in the Republican presidential primary, all the candidates were trying to out-conservative each other. Again, using the term very broadly without any context, when you always have to have an adjective for key terms. And sometimes it gets very strange. I know that in this current election in Georgia, one of the House candidates claimed to be to the right of Attila the Hun in an election. You know, I might use that metaphor myself to suggest that somebody's way out there, but to take that as a badge of credit strikes me as a bit odd. Whether you call it a silo or an echo chamber, clearly there's a tremendous amount of reinforcement. And one of the worst things that's happened, of course, is that it's reinforced by media as well. Again, people tend to self-select what news programs or whatever they tend to watch. But the fact of the matter is that so much of it is now coming from social media instead of the historically relied on news sources. For example, among millennials, I think the rate of millennials reading newspapers is 8%. And those historically were the better sources for more objective news, certainly more than talk radio. In that regard, the FCC didn't do us any favors in 1987 when they removed the fairness doctrine. Now you can just basically say whatever the hell you want to say on radio and without any responsibility for what you're saying. But there's a historic aspect to this as well. And Steve mentioned the 70s. Actually, the last period of relative consensus in this country was in the post-war period. And again, one of the things that happened in World War II was that people had the sense of all being in it together. And for a few years after that, we had behavior that was in keeping with that kind of mentality. For example, the ratio for CEOs to working people in their corporations in terms of remuneration was reasonable. Today, it's outrageous. Again, what we've seen is that we have undermined the idea of community and consensus and replaced it with our own preference. Again, remember movies like Wall Street, greed is good, those sorts of attitudes that are pervading our society today. In terms of parties, obviously, one of the things that exacerbated polarization was the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And what happened was that it flipped the South in terms of partisanship. The South, and to the great disadvantage of the Republican Party in one respect, in that it contaminated it, but it also increased their electoral base, which is an interesting situation. So with all its baggage, the southern states have joined the Republicans. But the parties themselves have been splintered. I mean, the southern states coming into the Republican Party, that was a splintering. Then you had the Tea Party coming into the Republican Party. More recently, you have the alt-right coming into the Republican Party. And indeed, even into the administration in the form of people like Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller, two people who were exclusionary people, anti-immigration and all that sort of stuff, and supporting even white supremacy and whatnot. The Dems have some splintering within their party as well. Steve mentioned the progressives versus the traditionalists, I suppose. So far, the splintering hasn't been quite as strong. Ironically, though, I find it ironic that one of the agents for that splintering was Bernie Sanders, who has labeled himself a democratic socialist. But when he was in Congress, he labeled himself an independent. But here he is trying to reshape the Democratic Party. So it's really a bit of an ironic situation. So it's the polarization is not just between the parties or various other social groups in society, it's also within the parties.
Thank you. Dr. Denney?
So I'm glad I'm in the cleanup position because I get to say yes to everything that they say and just add a little bit. From what Don said, I want to pick up on about southern states. One of the dynamics about the southern states that we're going to see and that we're seeing is that more people of color, especially Black people, are moving south again. So there was that great migration out of the South, North, Midwest, and to the West. But now more and more people, Black people, are moving back into the southern states, into the cities. So I think that gerrymandering is going to become truly the tool du jour of many of these political groups, as well as these cities and states, when you get down to the local level of really trying to create these race, if you will, race states or race pockets in these states. Because Black people are not really moving back into the rural areas, they're moving into the larger cities, which then puts you into this rural versus urban versus suburban situation. And so what we're starting to see is tribalism, in my viewpoint. We're moving more and more towards the haves and the have-nots, and being the only two parties that are out there that people are speaking to. And depending on which way the politics roll, when you look at someone like Donald Trump, he spoke to the have-nots. He said, I am not a politician. And when you look at, and when you talk to people who don't have much, politics is what put in their minds can put them into precarious situations, because We have the war on drugs, we have a war on crime, we have war on poverty, and all of these wars do not help people who are poor and disenfranchised find their footing. And so Donald Trump really came into a sweet spot of, I am anti-establishment, I am anti-politics, I'm going to drain the swamp, I'm going to get rid of all these people that have done you no good for decades. And he's even said that in his campaign against Joe Biden. How, after 47 years, are you going to do things any different than you did when you were in office before? And so the tribalism is real in the parties, and it's created a tribal people. And you know, right now, what we're going to see, and what the thing about tribalism is, you get to hold your leaders to a very high regard of accountability. And that's where some of Donald Trump's chickens are coming home to roost right now, but also where Joe Biden, if he is elected president, his are going to come home to roost as well, because he's made promises to the disabled, to the disenfranchised, to the people of color, to all of these people, that he's going to give them affordable housing, affordable health care, job growth, and he's going to have to come with it and really deliver on that in his first term if he's elected, you know, through this process. And so if not, we're going to see more and more tribalism. And I predict that as time goes on in the decades to come, we're going to see more and more of this kind of behavior, that Donald Trump just is the tip of the iceberg.
Thank you, guys. So we're going to move to this next question. And of course, you guys have the same questions that I do, but I'm going to, kind of condense the frame of this question a little bit. And I'm going to ask you, what do you think is the main factor that has impacted this election? So if you were to perhaps put a theme on this election, what would that factor, what would that element be in terms of what this election has been defined by? Professor Hess, you're first.
Well, I would say we've had a lot of, it's been 2020 has been a year. We have had, the COVID outbreak, the related economic crash and slowdown and turbulence related to that. Donald Trump has polled very poorly on his COVID response. But one of the things that's very notable about that is really just a lot of these overlying issues are connected to our very polarized society and political system. So when you start breaking down into the exit polling that's been starting to come out with this race, we've really seen that Republican voters who have gone for Trump have really separated those two issues. And rate Donald Trump very highly on his management of the economy, almost detaching, the real GDP figures and, the joblessness and these other standard, economic indicators from the COVID crisis, essentially saying that the economy was very strong. Trump was a great manager of the economy with deregulation and lowered taxes, and that the economy was booming, if only not for this externally this externally originating disease that came from China. So there's kind of a big separation from that. Whereas on the left, you would see, there's a belief that Trump has really abjectly failed in his COVID response, and he's given very, very low ratings on that. Other things, just the personality of Donald Trump. Donald Trump has never been a popular president. He has at his best reached the mid 40s, and at his worst, has been in the high 30s. But it's been remarkably stable for all the things that have happened, in these 4 years. Impeachment, COVID, the economy, a lot of things. But there's been just great stability in terms of how voters have reacted to Donald Trump. And it's kind of interesting just that how unusual the events around us are, how it's all kind of gotten mediated into this very polarized society where all of these events are being interpreted differently on the left and the right. And going back to your earlier question, you have to wonder, are we just so sorted into ideological camps that we're perceiving and understanding just very, very different worlds as we consume information?
Thank you. Dr. Doogie, what do you think has been the main factor to perhaps categorize this election or has influenced this election?
I wish there was a single factor. I can't think of any overriding factor in this election. There are a number of things. Steve pointed out some. Clearly, there's polarization, there's performance art, for lack of a better term. But one of the things that has affected this election in incredible ways, of course, is all the money that's being spent in terms of political advertising and such. I mean, here in Kentucky, the senatorial race, the candidates raised between them over $140 million in this campaign. I mean, think about what could be done in the state of Kentucky with $140 million in terms of a variety of different programs. So the cost of campaigns is something that is outrageous. Now, obviously, if you're president, you have a certain advantage. You have Air Force One and a variety of other perks that help you, although they claim oftentimes that these are not purely political events. Obviously, one of the things that I think has also been a major factor in this election is social media. And obviously, conspiracy theories, bots, and a variety of other disinformation campaigns have been part of this campaign. But again, there's that echo chamber thing, which makes people blind. Steve mentioned some of the Trump supporters' reaction to his treatment of the pandemic. Most experts rate his performance very poorly, and yet his supporters rate it pretty highly. Again, if you live in that echo chamber, you're not going to. I'm reminded of the Nixon situation. I happened to be in Indiana at the time, and my representative was one of the last people to support Nixon. He's on one of the news programs in the morning, and they were going to ask him how, in light of all the abuses, he could still support Nixon. And he interrupted the interviewer before he could finish the question and said, "Don't confuse me with the facts." Well, that is increasingly the attitude that persists in campaigns today. Don't confuse me with the facts. Again, people are acting purely on the basis of beliefs. It strikes me that one of the real problems we have in our society right now, and one that contaminates our elections, is that people are operating primarily on the basis of beliefs and prejudices, I might add, to make decisions rather than seeking out good information. Well, for one thing, it's not easy. It takes a little effort to do that. Knee-jerking is always easier than actually gathering good information. So it strikes me that, again, a lot of social media has had a major effect. And again, I said it's not possible to do one because a lot of these things are interconnected. Social media obviously plays a role in voter suppression as well. You had people receiving robocalls telling them not to vote, or telling them to vote in the wrong place, threatening them if they vote. I mean, again, there are all sorts of uses of media which have had a dramatic impact on campaigns. Clearly, voter suppression has taken a number of forms. We've seen a number of lawsuits go to the level of the Supreme Court trying to eliminate mail-in ballots in a variety of jurisdictions, or at least limit the amount of time that they could be counted, or whatever strategy serves them a moment. All of these things, it strikes me, are interconnected. I have great difficulty isolating a single one, Ms. Taylor.
And Dr. Denney, what do you think has been the influential factor for this election?
Money, 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 money. money and ideology. And so no matter where you get your information, whether it's on social media, the general media, that's accepted media, whatever you call it, this has been probably one of the most expensive political campaign that we probably have seen and maybe will ever see in our lifetime. Recently, the New York Times, I think it was October, a couple of weeks ago, said that the total cost of the race for the White House, the Senate, and the House is expected to hit nearly $14 billion. What could the state of Kentucky have done with $14 billion?
So in the matter of time, we're going to move past one of the questions that we had for the panelists, but that doesn't mean that I don't have great questions that I'm seeing right now in the Q&A box. So just a reminder to start sending those in. I see quite a few here, and it looks like we're going to start talking a little bit of numbers here. We're going to talk a little money, Dr. Denney. We're going to talk a little bit about polling, Professor Hess. We're going to talk a little bit about the Electoral College, Dr. Doogie. So I hope you guys have your numbers there and some is with 214. And I have a question here from the audience that said, did all the Bloomberg money fail to make a difference in Florida and Ohio? Because as we know, we're sitting here, Florida and Ohio both went red. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of the money? And what are our thoughts in terms of this Electoral College in general? Professor Hess, you're first.
I would say we have seen some of the most, like Don mentioned before, we have seen some of the most expensive Senate races in American history. One of the things that was really surprising is how much money was sunk into Senate campaigns that lost, right? So famously, the McGrath campaign lost here in Kentucky. There was Jamie Harrison in South Carolina. There was who was the opponent to John Cornyn in Texas? Maybe that shows you how problematic the candidate, the issue was in that campaign. But the candidate was shattering numbers. But one of the issues is that there has just been a lot of money in politics, and you can even see how the Biden campaign really had a big fundraising advantage. And I'm sure you guys have received a lot of texts and pop-up ads, and you've seen nothing but TV ads, and have just been completely saturated with that level of spending. People have really opened margin that we've seen. We've seen a lot of well-financed candidates go down. And you almost have to wonder, is there a threshold in which, money can only buy so much in terms of, building up campaign infrastructure. And even 2016, the Clinton campaign, out fundraised the Trump campaign, even after a lot of his promises to finance his own campaign. You have to wonder, is there a limit to how much money can buy in these campaigns?
Dr. Doogie or Dr. Denney, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll let Dr. Denney speak because she raised the issue of money.
So yeah, I think, Steve, you're right. How much can money buy? And I think a lot of what you're seeing, especially in the rural parts of the country, is it wasn't necessarily the money, but it was the grassroots, getting people to knock on doors and talk about what it is that their particular politician is going to do for that person that lives in that house. And that makes a whole lot of difference. I've seen things like school, people running for school board. The people that knock on doors are the ones that gets the votes. Yeah, money makes a lot of difference because you can poll and you can get on the TV and you can get, robocalls and you can get your flyers and your signs all over the place. But I think what makes the biggest difference and what we're seeing is that people who are actually going person to person, knocking on a door and saying, hey, this is what my particular person can do for you.
Well, that's a little bit more difficult. That's what we call retail politics, as opposed to wholesale. Most of the money goes for wholesale. That is, advertising on the various media sources. And before I talk about the difference in terms of retail, let me highlight the fact that one of the reasons that we see so much money in campaigns these days is because of a series of Supreme Court decisions and a circuit court decision in one instance, which basically eliminated all real barriers on campaign expenditures. Again, the idea of equating money with free speech is incredibly problematic, and it does buy things, even if it may not lead to electoral success. Adelson, the casino magnate in Las Vegas, donated $25 million to the Trump campaign. As a result, he got to basically determine a lot of our foreign policy towards Israel, including promoting the moving of the embassy, generating Trump's support for Netanyahu and a variety of other. Now, this foreign affairs is not my expertise, but campaign expenditure is a bit more. So you can buy influence with money now. So the idea that it's free speech, again, if it's money, how the hell is it free? Now, in terms of retail campaigning, one of the things that's happened is that there are some states that never see a presidential candidate. They're never on the ground in these states. They tend to focus their energies on a limited number of states. Now, whether or not their troops are out there doing something is another matter. I remember that during Obama's first campaign, John Carroll, who's a member of our board and a great guy, he and a number of people from Lexington were in Cincinnati and other places knocking on doors, encouraging participation by African Americans. So there can be some retail campaigning, but the dominant form of campaigning is wholesale. Even when a presidential candidate comes to a community or to wherever, a factory, whatever they're doing, it's really primarily for purposes of television reporting. It's free advertising. And so it's a staged event. And clearly Trump has been very good at staging events. But that's wholesale campaigning. And it's been the norm for the last few years. It might well be the case that if you could encourage more and more people to act as rank and file retail campaigners, it would be good. But it doesn't happen too much. Most of the retail campaigning used to be at the local level, but even that's diminished somewhat.
And let's talk a little bit about campaigning. So I have a question here that says, given Trump's increase in all categories, Black men, Black women, white women, Latino men, Latino women, and we're talking about, voters who are voting for Trump, in his 2016 results, how would you explain these new voters for Trump and also for Democrats? And what does this mean in terms of this realignment that's taking place amongst these voter demographics and perhaps campaigning and its correlation to it? Whoever wants to go first.
Well, I haven't seen all the numbers, but my hunch is that he's not improved in all those categories with any significant amount, especially among women. And in fact, the argument was that among suburban women, his rate has declined. I haven't seen the final data on this, so at this point, it's a bit of speculation. I can say, though, that among younger voters, there's been a greater turnout among younger voters, and that was largely organizing work done by the Democrats. And I suspect that most of that demographic in this election went that way. Again, the data is not fully out yet.
Dr. Denney, and I'll ask you this. So as a woman of color, I know that we have been looking in terms of how, race has played in this election. And I know that I have seen perhaps a Hispanic increase for Republicans. But of course, there's still a stronghold for Black Americans when it comes to the Democrats. But what is the Democratic Party going to have to do, moving forward to perhaps get our Latinx, Hispanic voters in the same way that perhaps we've seen African Americans with the Democratic Party?
Summer, you ask a really good question that the Democrats want to know the answer to as well. And I mean, to be honest, because what is it going to take? And I think what it's going to take is it's going to take some real listening to what that particular base is saying that they need and they want from their political leaders. I think that we half listen to what some of the demographics have to say. We assume that because you're Black, that you're going to vote Democrat, and because you're this, you're going to vote Republican. And that's not the case anymore. Much to what Steve and Donna said, people are getting their information from a variety of places. It's no longer your dad's politics, right? It's no longer the conversation that's happening at the dinner table and where you talk politics with your parents and then the whole family is Democrat and you've got that one crazy uncle that might be a conservative or vice versa. It's not that anymore. And I think so there's a piece of immigration that needs to be talked about, that needs to be addressed. I think the wall that is being built, or I don't even know if it's still being built, are they still putting panels up in Mexico? Because we don't hear about that much anymore, right? But now you still have the kids that were in cages that now they've lost, and all of that plays into who I am as a person and how I see the world and how I make sense of what this politics is going to do for people that look like me. And so the Democrats haven't gotten the answer to that yet. The Republicans have done a really good job of fear mongering among people around racial demographics and racial alliances. But the answer is really, I think we have to listen to the base and hear what they have to say about what is it that they really truly need and want in order for the playing field to be more equitable for them. Not everybody wants it to be the same. We just, a lot of people just want at least to have an advantage, to have access to something, right? To a good way of life.
Thank you. Professor Hess, I have a question for you. So what are your thoughts on the future of the business of polling? Also, do you think the misses on the 2016 and 2020 polls have contributed to the claims of fake news?
So we are in the world of forecast models, and they've kind of gotten a bad rap in 2016. There was a polling error especially in the upper Great Lakes, in the 3 states that flipped the so-called blue wall, with Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, where there was some state level polling misses. And some of the forecast models had an issue where they weren't accounting for education as much. So persons with college degrees are more likely to respond to a poll in general. So they tend to be represented. And there was a big split between Clinton and Trump in terms of education as a predictor of who you would vote for. So we've seen a shift in college-educated whites away from the Republican Party and towards the Democrats. And we've seen a shift in terms of whites without a college degree away from the Democratic Party, the old Union Rust Belt demographic from the Democrats to the Republicans. Although I should say that is an area where Biden has made up some ground in this campaign. So you guys mentioned a little bit about losses in people of color. That is one area. Although I should say, when you look at the numbers in terms of the demographic changes on that, it's like for Black women, Clinton had an advantage of plus 90, whereas Biden had an advantage of plus 83. So it should be in a little bit of context, and those numbers do matter, but it's still a large advantage for Democrats. But I'm getting away from the question. There was a polling error this year in favor of Trump. Obviously, it was much closer. Although I should say, at least from what it seems like right now, there was a big shift in terms of Latino voters, specifically in Florida and specifically with the Cuban American community. And so seemingly pollsters have not done a good enough job desegregating the different demographics that fall under Hispanic, because there's just meaningful differences within that group. And so that's an area where pollsters could definitely pick up some ground and improve things in that way. But across the board, though, I mean, we've seen a lot of, if you just look at the predictive models and which states were supposed to go which way, there's not a whole lot of surprises. Georgia is a toss-up, North Carolina is a toss-up, Texas is being closer than usual, but still leaning red. There's not, there's some surprises, but they're not big ones. But the big issue with polling that will be with us forever and ever is that polling is based on, it's a snapshot in time. It's not predictive. It's where you're at. It's just it struggles to look into the future, and then also the accuracy of polling is based on history. So, how you've needed to sample in the past, what demographic factors would predict who is actually going to turn out, and so when there's big shifts that happened in terms of likely voter models and other factors that you have to consider. Then sometimes there's unanticipated changes that happen. So pollsters have this continual challenge, but I'm not really sure it's one of those things where it's not perfect, but I'm not sure what we have that's better. So that's the big challenge of polling heading forward.
Thank you for that. So, we're starting to round out this panel in discussion. And of course, you guys know a lot of us are still sitting here with a lot of uncertainty about how this election is actually going to turn out. And I have a question here that says, chances a state might try to send electors on December 14th that don't represent the popular vote in that state. So we know that, Trump has already called for possible recounts in certain states for votes. We also know we have a Supreme Court nominee that has been threatened as possibly being the deciding factor in this election. So what about, back to Electoral College, what is the chances that electoral would break with the popular vote and vote that did not reflect what the citizens voted for? Dr. Doogie, do you think you have an answer for that?
Well, in the first place, we call those persons faithless electors. And in most states now, states require that the electors vote as the popular vote went. Now, there are a couple of states where there's some variation. I mean, Maine and Nebraska allocate electors differently. But in 48 of the states, it's winner take all, no matter what the vote was for the winner. Again, someone can win the popular vote in a state with a plurality. They don't have to have a majority, and they would get all the electoral votes. And the fact of the matter is that most states, in the past, it was a moral obligation to vote the way the popular vote went. But in the last 30 years, most states have made it a legal requirement that they do so. So when you're voting in any state on election day, you're actually voting for a slate of electors who will then go to Washington on December 15th and actually decide the election. But the idea that somehow you'll have a whole group of faithless electors seems highly improbable. Now, the other stuff is likely to happen, going to the Supreme Court and whatnot,
Yeah, I know. There's a lot of uncertainty there. And speaking of that uncertainty, and I think we can kind of end on this question, because I think beyond this election, we're also thinking, what is going to happen for the next 4 years? What is going to happen for this generation? What's going to happen for the legacy of America going forward? And addressing two questions that I see here that speak specifically to communication in such polarized times, and communication to people who might be on a different spectrum than you, and the political spectrum in terms of ideology. What do we do to have those conversations? Should we participate in those conversations? How do we move forward as citizens conversing with amongst one another in this, in this environment?
You can answer that question. You'll be rich and famous by Thursday. It's a difficult question. In the first place, as several of us have suggested, people tend to reinforce their beliefs rather than to seek to challenge them, whether it's silos or echo chambers or whatever. It's difficult to get people to engage alternative points of view, and certainly even worse, engage facts. To some extent, the culture war that people are talking about is about the difference between facts and opinions. And there are those of us who would prefer to live in a world of facts rather than rabid opinions, but whether or not we could ever achieve that. I mean, somebody asked me the other day about the Enlightenment, or earlier about the Enlightenment. Well, the fact of the matter is that that was a battle of the same type between so-called factual information and information based on belief, myth, mumbo jumbo, or whatever. Clearly, today it's even worse in many respects because of the amplifying effect of media, social media in particular. So the short answer is we're not likely to see any immediate amelioration of these silos, echo chambers, whatever you want to call them, of the ideological disagreement.
Thing that that will address this problem is just generational turnover. Some of our best in terms of being inclusive and in terms of being tolerant, in terms of being open-minded, are our youngest people. So Generation Z provides a lot of hope for us.
Well, it did in some areas, Steve, like with gay marriage and things like that. One of the things, we didn't have a chance to go fully into the Electoral College and the problems that it generates. But one of the things I jokingly say is that if you're concerned about the disproportionate influence of red states and you are blue, move to a red state. That's a strategy that's being used by the libertarians in New Hampshire right now. They calculated that with about 20,000 people, they could take over the politics of the state, which is an interesting development.
I think that there's hope. And I do agree that the generations are going to be our greatest hope. We're seeing ourselves right now in a new civil rights movement, like we saw back in the 60s. And so something good hopefully will come of that at the end of this, if there is an end. And I'm hopeful, regardless of who the president is, the real work is at your local level, is in, who is your senator, who is your councilman. That's where the real work needs to happen, and change needs to happen in my eyes. And the presidential politics is one thing, but what are we doing on the local level, and how are we situating ourselves and our young people to understand local politics and what power they do have in making a difference and making change happen?
I would only note that the problem with generational change is that that's at least 20 years.
Professor Hess, did you want to finish out your answer?
Oh yeah, and there's also just the hope that we can generate more social capital. As people go out, participate in their communities, volunteer, even not even in controversial, overtly political ways, but going out, helping people in your community, rebuilding your community, showing up, showing up at City Hall, showing up to vote. Contributing to your community in all these different ways, working together with people that are around you, and then also just make a conscious effort to connect with people who are not in your ideological bubble. There are areas of agreement. We had, even in the Trump era, we had a important bill in terms of criminal justice reform that was a very bipartisan bill that was formulated by Democratic and Republican leaders in the Obama years. And unfortunately, the Senate Majority Leader sat on it for a couple years to deny the president a legislative accomplishment. But the next president did pass it. It's very significant, some of the criminal justice reform that has happened. And so there are windows of opportunity where people can come together from the left and the right in order to address common problems. And so it's just a matter of finding places where people can work together, to pursue the common good. So there is just general hope from that. And the more grassroots it is, the better impact it has on society.
Thank you. I couldn't end this panel without a little hope for our audience before they leave here. I know Dr. Doogie, he's an advisor of mine. It's always easy for Dr. Doogie to provide us the realistic view of the situation at hand, but we can at least be a little optimistic. We have a little hope, hoping that we can see some change generated out of discussions like these. So as we come to the conclusion of our town hall, I do want to thank all of our panelists for their time and thoughtfulness in the discussion of these important questions. So thank you all for being here. I would also like to thank our audience for attending this evening's post-election town hall hosted by the Political Science Department and the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee. I hope that some of the questions and concerns have been answered this afternoon, and I really do hope that as we move forward as a community and as a nation, that we would rebuild our communal unity, our election system, our government, in order to form, a very cliche, a more perfect union for generations to come. So please be on the lookout for upcoming Transylvania panel discussions and town halls. And thank you all once again for attending. Be safe and have a great evening.